Thank you, Rotary, for having me today. I'm going to show you a few pictures as I talk about sort of what I've been doing the last few years. Can everybody hear me? Good? No? How about that? Is that better? Okay. If you see the map here, that is primarily the Concordia Parish in 3 counties in southwestern Mississippi. When I started writing about one particular case 10 years ago, I never thought that it would be linked to any other murders, and I never thought that I would discover the secret organization of a Klan offshoot known as the Silver Dollar Group. Of these 8 murders, the first one began in February of 1964, and the last one occurred in February of 1967. The people that were murdered were, I actually covered 9 murders in my book, but attribute 8 to the Silver Dollar Group. Of the 8, there was one white man that was murdered, actually, a guy named Earl Hodges, and he was murdered by the Klan because they feared he was going to go to the FBI and tell what he knew. So the Silver Dollar Group was sort of, and it's sort of a crude term, I really don't know how else to say it, but these were all members of the traditional Klan who felt once the civil rights, during the debate of the Civil Rights Bill in 63, 64, as it began to be talked about, they sort of mobilized. They knew about Freedom Summer was coming to Mississippi, and all of these men were just basically felt that the traditional Klans had failed at Oxford in 62 and had failed at all the other places, and that the only means in which to stop integration and all of the things that went with the Civil Rights Bill would be to go underground, to be in absolute secrecy. And the leader of the group was a man by the name of Red Glover, lived in Vidalia, which is across the river from Natchez, Mississippi. And he personally recruited every member of the Silver Dollar Group. And when he recruited someone, it was someone that he could trust, and he gave each one of them a silver dollar that was minted in the year of their birth. This particular silver dollar was shown to me by the son of this Silver Dollar Group member. His name was Ursel Boyd. And you can see down at the bottom it was minted in 1922. So all of these cases individually are interesting. They deal with the communities, they deal with how those communities function, and they deal with what happens when a murder occurs in the community and nothing is done, and when there's no justice. Let me get back to my, we might be missing a picture, but we'll get to it. No, go back. Well, there's one shot of Frank Morris's shoe shop, and he's, and that's who I want to talk about to you today. Frank Morris started a shoe shop in Faraday in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And it became very popular both within the black and white communities. He did outstanding work, and he became sort of a figure in the community that was respected by basically everybody. Frank was a charitable. He was a man, if you drove by on the street, if you drive through Faraday, you can drive right by his shop every day. The concrete foundation is still there. He was well known, and he was well liked. But in the 1960s, when the Klan got worried about civil rights, Frank was targeted. And there were many rumors that circulated Faraday for 50 years, and one of the hardest things I had to do when I started writing the story, and the way I started was I heard that, and this is the way I got into this, is back in 2007 the FBI announced, and Justice Department announced, they were going to go back and look at 100+ unsolved civil rights era murders, and Frank Morris's name was on that list. Well, I wrote my first story within just a few hours of hearing his name for the first time, and I thought, well, you know, I write a column for the paper that looks at our history, and I'm interested in history, but I thought, you know, how is it possible to go back, you know, almost 50 years and find people, I didn't even know where to start. So I wrote the first story, about 530 words, very short story. And I thought, honestly, that would probably be it. And then a few days later, I got a phone call from Rosa Williams. And Rosa Williams was the granddaughter of Frank Morris. She had grown up in Faraday. She was 12 when he was murdered. And somebody had sent her a paper. And she said, I learned more in that one article than I have known for all of my life. No one ever told me what happened. My family, we've always have wanted to know. And she says, you don't understand how hard that is to live your life day after day. And the way all of these victim families feel as if, they feel alone and isolated and no one really cares about them or their story. And I can tell you these type of incidents, unsolved murders, the lack of justice last in communities forever. And if you don't address them, and if you don't figure out what happened, and if you don't figure out why it happened, these things will live on forever, and we will never really understand what your community was like. The Klan tried desperately after Frank was murdered. And let me tell you first what happened to him. He goes to sleep, and that's him on the far right. He's standing back behind his counter there. Frank was in the back of the shop, asleep. He had a little room back there, and there was a small house right beside his shop where his grandson would stay with Frank's full-time employee. Frank was in the shop that night, December 10, 1964. It was after midnight, and he heard glass breaking. So he gets up to see what's going on, and as he comes to the front of the shop, he looks through that window. You can see it right there, and it's been broken. He sees two men. One has a gasoline can, and the other one has a shotgun. He yells out, "What are you doing? Stop that," as he walks toward the window, and at that moment, one of those men threw a match into the building, and it just whoosh. The whole place was engulfed in flames. He tried to get out the front door, but when he got to that front door, a man with a shotgun pointed it at his head and said, "Get back in that shop." And he didn't say it as nice as I just said it. So Frank had to turn around, come out the back door of the shop. And as he did, two Faraday policemen were driving by. They noticed that it looked like an explosion had happened in the building. There were cinder blocks out on the ground. And as they passed the front of the building, Frank emerged from the back of the shop. He was on fire, and the fire had burned the clothes off of his body. He suffered his body was third-degree burns head to toe. He was taken to the Concordia Parish Hospital, and there he lay for 4 days until he died. That's Frank standing by the front door there. Leaned over, you can see he still has that apron on and his visor. This is November. This is a month before the fire. That's the day after. And that's the room in the back of the shop where he was asleep, and you can see the little cot there. To the right, you can see a refrigerator, and that's where he emerged from when he heard the glass breaking. The FBI came to Faraday. They spent a year and a half, 2 years intensively investigating. And what they learned, the primary motives that would come up initially, was that Frank Morris was somehow basically a pimp who was pimping white girls to black men and using the back room of the shop. And there was one rumor after one rumor like that. And unfortunately, Faraday believed that for 50 years. You know, the one approach the Klan would always take is, well, maybe if we make a man immoral, that will help the white community to turn their head and be more sympathetic to the Klansmen or to the people that did this. And after much work, we were able to find out what the real motive was for that crime, and I'll tell you about that real quickly. So Concordia Parish crossed the river from Natchez, Mississippi, and Concordia has a long, long history of corruption in law enforcement, of brutality in law enforcement. And it has a long history of prostitution and gambling and you name it. It was a rough, tough place in which to live. So in 1966, the FBI sends this man here, John Pfeiffer, to Faraday. He says, they tell him, you go up there and figure out, try to resolve this Frank Morris murder, and by then there was another Klan murder they were also looking into, but he said, basically, figure out what you have to do something about law enforcement. Until the sheriff and his chief deputy are out of office, this situation will never, ever get better. So the first night that Pfeiffer's in Faraday, he's staying at the Patricia Motel, and he gets a phone call from the assistant special agent in charge in New Orleans named Joseph Esther, and he says to him, he says, John, there's a warrant been arrested for, there's a search warrant and an arrest warrant that has been put out on Sam Bowers. Sam Bowers was the head of the White Knights in Mississippi, and the arrest warrant was for the murder of Vernon Dahmer in Hattiesburg. So this is the first night Pfeiffer is on the job in Faraday. When he got there, there were rumors that there were 12 black men that were missing. Pfeiffer told me the file was so thick on Faraday that he didn't have time to read it before he left. It was just too much information in there. And the FBI did something really remarkable. They said, you go and you decide what do we need to do? How do we stop this sheriff's office? So as he's searching for Bowers in southern Concordia Parish, they don't find him, but they're driving up Highway 15. And over the Mississippi River levee, they can see this glow. And so Pfeiffer's with another agent named Ted Gardner, and they agree, let's cross the levee and see what that light is. So they do. And they see this building and these parking lot, just expansive parking lot filled with cars and trucks, and they can hear music coming out of this building. And so they open the door, and it'd be just like a movie, you know, the smoke pours out and he looks. And through those doors they can see blackjack tables and roulette wheels and all kinds of gambling going on, women dressed in negligees, and they sidle up to the bar. It's 3 deep at the bar. And they talk to the manager of the bar and say, do you know, showed them a picture of Bowers, and they look around and nobody knows who Bowers, and no one's seen Bowers. So they step outside and they walk over into a dark little corner of the parking lot, and as they're sitting there, they see this limousine drive up, and these men in business suits are in the limousine. And a little while later, these 4 girls come out and get into the limousine with the men. So Pfeiffer says, let's follow this car. They do. And they follow the car as it goes to Vidalia, crosses the Mississippi River Bridge, and leaving Louisiana and going into Mississippi. And they know right away, Pfeiffer says, we have a federal racketeering case. We know that this would not be existing if the sheriff's office was not aware of this. So this is in January of '66. About a short time later, Governor McKiffin meets with the pastors, and they want to discuss the parish's moral problem. And believe me, Concordia had a real moral problem in a lot of ways. And so the state police began to investigate as well. And the pastors urged the governor to padlock, which is basically a legal term, shut it down. It becomes such a big story in Concordia Parish. It becomes a big statewide story as well. And in late 66, a new DA is elected. He takes office in January of 67, and he closes the bar. So everybody, and the state police continues to do raids throughout the parish. I mean, there was prostitution and gambling just about everywhere you go. Faraday was the only town in the United States that had a slot machine in the post office. And so they shut the Morville Lounge, and people forget about it for years. But what they don't know is that John Pfeiffer, working with U.S. attorneys out of Shreveport, and during that period of time from 1966 to the early 70s, we have an election. Johnson goes out, Nixon goes in, you have new U.S. attorneys. It slowed, but it did not hamper the investigation. 1972, the chief deputy, a guy by the name of Frank DeLauder, and two other men are prosecuted in federal court for the beating of a prisoner in the Faraday jail. Then the Sheriff Noel Cross in 72 is convicted, but he seeks a new trial in federal court for this place was known as the Morville Lounge. Very, very famous place, particularly at that time. After his conviction, he appeals, and that's him taking his 8th term of office, 1970s. A few months after that, all of his appeals are denied. He steps down, and Governor Edwin Edwards appoints a former legislator named Fred Shealy to finish out his term. The Morville Lounge and all of the prostitution and gambling, the connection was the Carlos Marcello mob that sent before they opened that lounge, and they paid the sheriff $200 or $300 a week in cash, before they opened that lounge, they sent a committee, a feasibility study. How would a lounge work in southern Concordia Parish with prostitution and all the things that we can provide? And they found out quickly it was quite a great market because of its remote location. They went into Natchez. They opened a service station so they could keep their fleet of limousines. They rented a warehouse from the Daughters of the American Revolution who didn't know what they were leasing it for. And Pfeiffer, the FBI agent, they found out they never actually knew how much money went through that place, but in the 60s, it was, they knew that for an 18-month period, at least $250,000 in checks were written for prostitution. But they also knew that it was way more cash. They never could get a handle on the gambling. But you put that in today's, it was a huge, huge operation. So there is the corruption aspect of why Concordia, the FBI referred to Concordia Parish as a, quote, maggot-infested mess. They knew it was going to be a massive, long-term, multi-year effort. They never did solve the Frank Morris murder. Pfeiffer went on to retire. He's from Ohio. He died a few years ago. He's from Ohio. He was an English Lit major from Princeton before he joined the FBI in the 1960s. He always wanted to be an FBI agent, but he thought you had to be an accountant or a lawyer to be one. He was drinking beer with a fellow Marine one day, and the Marine said, no, you don't have to. And so he said, where do I sign? And he ended up in New Orleans and ended up getting sent to Faraday. The thing that helped me, and over these years in all of these cases, I've been very fortunate to have many people who worked with me and helped me. LSU, the Manship School, has been absolutely outstanding, working with students, working with a cold case program that they started. many, many people have helped me, but Pfeiffer was in retirement, and I called him when I started working on these stories, and I started finding out how he had been involved in Concordia Parish. And first he was reluctant to talk to me because he didn't know me, and he didn't trust me. So it took many months of talking, and he finally opened up to me. And the more he talked, the madder he got about this case had never been solved. And he started talking about the things that he could remember. And he told me, he said, the one thing that we could never, ever do in the Frank Morris case was this chain, this link from the perpetrator, and who did that lead back to? We knew, he said, it led to the sheriff's office, and we knew it led back to the chief deputy, this man named Frank DeLauder. But he said we could not put the pieces together. And they followed all the leads that the Klan had done this because of prostitution, or up to Frank Morris, that he was involved in prostitution, and all of those dead ended. I remember one day an 83-year-old lady called me, 85-year-old lady. She wouldn't tell me her name. And she said, Mr. Nelson, I just want to tell you, I have been reading your stories week after week about Frank Morris and about these allegations that he is an immoral man, you know, that he had prostitution, all these things. She says, you know, I have done business with that man for 20 years. And he comes out to my car when I drive up, and he'll take my order. If my kids are there, he'll give them some candy. I come back in a few days, he comes out and hands me my order. And she says, all this business about this white women and prostitution, she said, you know, I wasn't a bad-looking lady back then. She said, he didn't proposition us or talk ugly to us or say things bad to us. He was nothing but respectful. And it's a point I make over and over because in many of these cases, the Klan sought to make immoral people that were just living their day-to-day lives, doing what they did, but because the color of their skin, they found a way to do something. There were also Klansmen jealous of Frank Morris because he had a business. So what was the motive? Well, in the old FBI documents and in some things that I had found, a little-known thing happened back in 1964, a few weeks prior. Frank Morris, the shoe shop owner, had had an argument with Frank DeLauder, the chief deputy. DeLauder was 6'4", he was a huge man. And the sheriff's office and the deputies were notorious for walking to a liquor store, walking to any store. If they wanted some alcohol, just pick it up and walk out with it. Go in the grocery store, they see a ham looks good, pick it up, walk out. Nobody was afraid to challenge him. But Frank Morris challenged him. DeLauder kept expecting him to do his shoe repair work, and there was an argument over a pair of cowboy boots that DeLauder wouldn't pay for. And that turned out to be the motive. And people say, particularly young people, don't understand this. How do you go and kill a man, burn his shop down, and how do you do that over an argument over shoes? And the reason is so simple. It's because he, as a black man, was talking to a white man who happened to be a deputy. He was an uppity N-word in the mind of Frank DeLauder and to a lot of men inferior in that day. And he needed to be taught a lesson. So I call old law enforcement people who served around or who knew, or in law enforcement who had a connection to Faraday. I made a list at the beginning because cops know everything. They know everybody. They remember everything. And I'd go down that list and I ask them about this case or that case, and one after one I did it, and I was just about out of names. And finally I called this guy named Frazier from up in Minden. I told him who I was. He says, oh, I know who you are. I said, well, I'm working on the Frank Morris case. You ever hear of him? He said, oh yeah, I knew about Frank Morris. I said, well, do you know anything about it? what happened to him? He said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. He says, my ex-brother-in-law told me about that case years and years ago. This man is named Leonard Spencer, and he was from Morville. He said, my brother-in-law and another man named Cooney Paso went to that shop, burned it down on orders of the sheriff, on orders of the deputy. And we were able to find this man's ex-wife, his son, his son's wife, all related this story, that they had, this man Spencer and Paso had gone to the shoe shop simply to burn it down. They did not expect Frank Morris to be there that night. Frank, at times, did not always stay in the shop. When he came out to the front, they didn't expect him to be there. Of course, they set him on fire anyway. I went and visited Spencer. This picture was taken in June of 2010, right before the 4th of July. He acknowledged being in the Klan, but he said he didn't know anything about Frank Morris. And this other guy, Cooney Paso, said, I never heard of that man's name in my life. And that man, Spencer's son, said that man, Cooney Paso, was like a grandfather to me. Yet he said he never heard that name. In November of 2010, we were ready to go with a story, but the FBI didn't want us to run it because we called them for a comment, and they were shocked to know that we had found this out. And they had known about this man for almost more than a year and had done nothing. We started with the FBI, then they turned us over to the Justice Department. Please don't run this story. Why? You'll jeopardize our investigation. We'd ask why. They'd say, well, we can't tell you. And we come to find out that they had not done all of the investigations that they needed to do, and they had not even yet interviewed this man, although they had known about him for more than a year. So we agreed to hold the story for a little while, and then in January of 2011, that's half of a front page, we ran the story. And if you look at the bottom, I mean, this is just a tidbit of information. You see in the center at the bottom, that's Tom Perez was the head of the cold cases for the DOJ at that time. Of course, now he runs the Democratic Party. There are so many angles to this story and so many things that I could tell you. There's not enough time. People always ask me, what do you do this for? I've been doing this for 11 years now, and it's not pleasant work to do. I've been all through Louisiana, and I have been through the hills and hollows of Mississippi, and I can tell you a thing that I found to be true is that the worst Klansmen all live at the end of dead-end roads. And so they say, why do you do this? Well, to me, I want to know why these things happen and why these local communities never did anything about it. And I wanted to know, how do we forget people like that? And I learned as I was reporting how important it is for us to know what the truth is, not what rumors or what lies are. All of our citizens in our communities deserve that. And we as communities ought to require that. And we remember that next time there's an unsolved murder, there's always a family that wants to know what happened. So what good can come out of it? It's amazing what truth can do. This is a picture of a man on the left is David Watley, who lives in Baton Rouge now. David Watley was involved in civil rights and fairness. The Klan, the Silver Dollar Group, attempted to kill him one night with a bomb, but it didn't detonate properly. One of the men that tried to kill him was this lady's father. I had written a story several years ago identifying her daddy as one of the bombers. Excuse me, I have allergies. And this devastated her. She lived a terrible life. I always tell people about Klansmen, particularly the roughest ones. If your daddy was going out at night, burning buildings down, kidnapping and torturing people, doing everything bad that you can think of, they probably weren't too nice at home either. And they weren't. But she felt so bad about this. She wanted to express to David Whatley that she was ashamed of what her daddy had done, and she was sorry. Whatley was the first guy to integrate Faraday High School, and the abuse that man suffered is unbelievable. Ran him out of town one night, put him on a bus, sent him to an army base, went to Vietnam, got hurt. Got back home. He told me I always thought about the fact that I wasn't good enough to go to Faraday High School, but I was good enough to go and serve and get shot for my country. This for David was important. And even a bigger case, in Mississippi, 2 black teenagers, and this is one of the 8 murders that I cover from the Silver Dollar Group, were murdered in 1964. They were kidnapped in Meadville, Mississippi. They were taken and beaten in a barn, and they were transported across the Mississippi River Bridge through Vidalia and taken to an old river channel south of Tallulah at Parker's Island, at Davis Island. And they both were thrown, bound, one to a Jeep chassis, the other one to rail ties, and while alive, were thrown over into the old river. 19 years old. Had done absolutely nothing. The Klan thought one of them was a revolutionary because he had been to Chicago. Come back, he had a red bandana on, went to visit his aunt. You had a bandana on, you had a goatee, the Klan considered you a revolutionary. He couldn't stand it. The man on the right, Thomas Moore, his brother, was one of the 2 boys that was killed. Thomas joined the Marines, left town on his mother's urging, didn't want to go back to Mississippi, but he did go back with another Canadian filmmaker. A long story short, there were 2 living Klansmen. This one, who was involved in the kidnapping and the beating of those boys, but who was not involved in the murder, but technically he was involved in the murder because he was involved in the process that started the murder. And there was another Klansman named James Ford Seale who was still alive, who was one of the instigators of the event. No other witnesses were alive. The FBI went to, and this man, Charles Edwards on the left, ran Thomas and this filmmaker off his property many times as they was trying to figure out what happened. Finally, though, this man agreed for immunity to testify against James Ford Seale in federal court in 2007 in Jackson. After Edwards finished his testimony, he asked the judge, could he say something? The judge said yes, cleared the jury. He asked Thomas Moore and the other family, will you forgive me for what I did? He said, what I did was wrong. I was a different man. He says, I hope one day you can do that. Thomas Moore said he would try. He went back to his home in Colorado. He talked to his pastor, his church, and to his family. He wanted to go back to Mississippi one more time, and he went back in 2011. He went to Charles Edwards' house. He went to church with him at the all-white Bunkley Baptist Church, went out into Charles Edwards' fruit garden, fruit orchard. They picked fruit, and they talked. Thomas had 2 or 3 questions, but one question, he says, do you ever think about my brother? And Edwards says, every day of my life, I think about your brother. And I think, how did I involve myself in something so heinous? He says, and I often thought that God took my brother, took my son when he was young because of what I did all those years ago back in 1964. I felt that was part of my punishment. But he says, yes, I do think about your brother. Thomas Moore had lived his life hating Franklin County, and he forgave Charles Moore, and that changed both of those men's lives. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you.